Hey guys, Will here. So today's video we're going to be talking about our 65-inch 4K sim rig and some of the things that you need to consider very seriously before you even aspire to having a setup like this. Now, ever since we built this rig, which is well over a year, about almost 18 months ago now, we've had a surprisingly large number of people messaging us sort of saying, hey, I want to set up a rig just like yours, and what do I need to do? What do I need to set up? What do I need to buy? And so forth. And while the driver's eye or helmet cam footage that we are able to record in this rig is pretty mind-blowing, there are certainly some really important things that you need to consider before building a rig like this for yourself. Now, the thing that I always say to people, and this is one of the things that I love about sim racing rigs and hardware, is the fact that everybody has their own take, everybody has their own priorities in what they think is most important to them and their driving experience that they're trying to achieve with their particular setup. Now, the thing that you need to know before we even get into the list of, I guess, things that we need to cover here is that everything that we've done here, from the way we've got the motion set up, the way we've got the wind simulation, the way we've got the seating position, the monitor position relative to the rig, all those things are all done with content creation in mind, even down to the angles that we have on the screens here so that we can actually place a camera on top of this tripod and have it look like it's actually inside the cabin of the car. All those things and all the things that we've done in terms of tweaking and adjusting the rig are all done with content creation at the forefront of what we're trying to do here. And the reason why that's so important is because there is a lot of things that I would do differently if I was setting up a rig purely just for my own enjoyment, content creation completely aside. So let's get started. Let's go through the list of things that you need to consider before even thinking about building a sim rig like this one. So the first consideration is just how much PC grunt you're actually going to need to run a rig like this in the first place. Now, each one of these displays is 4K native resolution. We are able to run at 144 Hertz on each of these monitors too. So you can imagine running triple 4K, which is 11520 by 2160 resolution at 144 Hertz, is not a simple thing to do. So come around the back with me quickly here, and let's take a look at what we've got here in terms of our sim racing PC. Now, it looks a little bit crude. We've got it on an open frame design here, and this is something that we're actually looking at rebuilding this year. Those who follow the channel regularly would know about that. So the brains of the operation here, just to quickly take you through, this is an 11900K processor, which we've got overclocked to 5.2 gigahertz on every core. We've got a 3090 graphics card there as well, which is running relatively stock clocks. You can see we've got a all-in-one cooler on the CPU. Generally speaking, the load on the CPU isn't absolutely massive, so that has been adequate for cooling. We've got a high-end motherboard there as well. We've got a 1200 watt power supply sitting in there. And all in all, that gear alone, I mean, just the graphics card alone is worth well over 3,000 Australian dollars. So the Sim PC in its entirety, and that is just responsible for operating the simulation itself. That's not responsible for capturing or cameras or anything like that. Just that PC alone is almost 10,000 Australian dollars once you add in all the componentry, the RAM, the storage, all those bits and pieces. So, it's very expensive to build a gaming PC, which is going to be adequate for running the monitors at the resolution that you want for a triple 4K setup like this, but also not having to sacrifice too much in terms of graphics settings. The last thing you want to do is have, the massive resolution, but have to crank the graphics all the way down to be able to have it run at a decent frame rate. And obviously frame rate is extremely important when it comes to sim racing in particular, so certainly not something that you want to skimp on. Now, another big part of that as well is, of course, the consideration of the actual screens that you're going to be using on your rig. Now, I mentioned before that these are actually big format gaming displays, so they're not TVs, they're capable of 4K at 144 Hertz. Now, one of the questions I get asked most commonly is, what kind of TV should I use for a big setup like this? Now, there are starting to be some pretty decent TVs on the market now which can handle relatively high refresh rates and also relatively low input lag. Input lag is one of the big killers when it comes to using a TV for a sim racing rig or any sort of gaming rig. But the point here is that it isn't as simple as just getting a screen that has nice color reproduction. You're going to need to get something that has high refresh rate. You're going to need to have something that has low input lag as well. And of course, all those things mean extra money spent as well. Now, to put it in perspective, these are Omen Imperium X big format gaming displays. Those were between $9,000 and $10,000 Australian each when they're available on the market. Now, there are alternatives now that are a lot cheaper than that. The LG C1s as an example, I think they come in at around about 4,000 or 5,000 Australian each. But again, it is a massive, massive, massive expense when you compare that to, you know, something that's a lot smaller and will obviously need a, you know, a less high-end PC to run it as well. Now, of course, you could run the screens at lower resolution, and I actually did do that back when I was running a 2080 Ti for Assetto Corsa Competizione, because we simply just couldn't run the displays at 4K natively at a decent refresh rate. But that means a sacrifice of obviously lower resolution. You're seeing individual pixels, and it just doesn't have the clarity that you really want if you're spending that kind of money on displays. So those are considerations there. Next thing to talk about on my little list here is heat. So heat is a really, really big consideration too. There is absolutely no way that I can run this rig in a room that isn't air conditioned. Now, I say that living in Australia, our ambient temperature here, generally speaking, inside the house is sort of between about sort of 18 degrees Celsius and maybe 26, 27 degrees Celsius on a hot day. If I don't have air conditioning on in the room, and this was the same at the old studio, which was in my garage as well, it'd get up to 33, 35, sometimes even 38 degrees Celsius inside the room within sort of 15, 20 minutes. And that is a combination of the heat being generated by the PC, but also the heat that's spilling off the screens as well. So you are not going to want to set up a rig like this in a room that you don't have air conditioning available or some sort of ventilation going on. It does get very, very hot very, very quickly. Now, it should be obvious to most people, but I'm going to say it anyway, heat is a byproduct of power consumption. Now, power consumption is a very important consideration here. We've actually load balanced this or spread the load across two separate circuits inside the studio. We did the same at my old studio as well, just to avoid any issues with popping circuit breakers. Now, without going into a massive amount of detail here, the full sum of the power consumption at peak, obviously it is quite transient because you've got motion going and, you know, sometimes the wheelbase is going at full strength, sometimes it's not, and so forth. But peak power consumption here between the motion system, the SIMUCUBE to Ultimate, the screens, the ambient lighting system, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, all of those little bits and pieces and all the ancillary components that go along with that, as well as the PC, add up to about 1900 watts. So here in Australia, the maximum amount of current that you can draw, or the maximum amount of wattage that you can run on a single circuit, is 2400 watts or 10 amps at 240 volts. So we are pretty darn close to the limit of what we're able to run across one circuit here before we have to move across to like an industrial kind of three-phase type setup, which is of course very expensive as well. So you definitely are going to want to consider exactly what the power consumption is going to be of your system, particularly with the monitors. These monitors aren't too power thirsty. They're around sort of 250 to 350 watts each, depending on the brightness level that you have them wound up to, but they can go way, way, way above that. And I do have the brightness cranked down quite a bit on these. If I were to crank them up to the maximum amount of available brightness, then it would actually push me over that 2400 watt limit. So that is definitely something to be mindful of as well. Now, you're also going to want to be mindful of just the amount of sheer physical space a rig like this is going to take up. So not only in 2 dimensions on the floor, but 3 dimensions as well, because you do also need to consider the height. So what we have here is about 2.5 meters wide by about 2.5 to 3 meters deep. Again, that's going to depend on the sim rig and how far you want to have that back from the screens. Ideally, you want to have the wheelbase up as close to the screen in front of you as possible. And we'll talk about all that stuff in a moment too. But you also need to consider the lighting setup too. Now, you've seen before in other videos our ambient lighting system. If you want to learn more about that, I'll drop some links down in the description below for you. But essentially what's happening here is these light strips are replicating the lighting that's going on the screens to give us ambient lighting and illuminate the wheel, illuminate my hands, my legs, and all the things around me like I'm driving, as would happen in the real world. Now, if you don't have those lights high enough, you've probably already guessed they're going to start reflecting off the screens. And you can probably already see it in the camera based on the position that Tom's holding that camera now. If you move around, if you move up and down, you can see the reflection of those lights on the screens in certain positions. So that has all had to be calculated based off my driving position and the position of the camera when we're actually filming in the rig. And if those lights are even an inch lower than they are right now, then we start to run into issues with reflections on the screens. Now, obviously you don't need to run an ambient lighting system, but it does add a lot to the immersion. I see quite a few people running rigs where they put a hood over the top and have lights quite low. And in pretty much every single case that I've seen, at least, you're seeing reflections of those lights on the screens. And that is definitely something that you're going to want to avoid, particularly if you're looking at making content. But just anything like that that's going to take away from the immersion of the experience with weird things that you wouldn't have in the real world is something that you're definitely going to want to consider there. So again, to reiterate there, about 2.5 meters wide by 2.5 to 3 meters depth. And then we're looking at a 9-foot ceiling here as well. Those lights are just under, probably just a little bit over 8 feet off the ground. And then of course you can see all of the black material that we've got around the back of the rig. And that is intended purely just to remove any other distractions from the camera. So the idea being anything above the screen is black, anything below the screen is black. All you're seeing is just the screens, my hands, the steering wheel, and that is pretty much it. So the next thing you're going to want to think about is giant car syndrome. Now this is something that I was really concerned about when we were building this rig, because I honestly had no idea whether it was going to be a massive issue or not. So what I mean by giant car syndrome is pretty much exactly that. Does the car seem absolutely giant in comparison with what you would have in real life? Now this is ultimately going to be a function of the physical area that you have inside the rig compared to what it would be in the real world. And I can imagine if I sit down in the rig quickly now, what we're sitting in at the moment is an M2 competition, which is exactly the same car that I have in real life. So it's actually a pretty good comparison here. Now in real life, the door is obviously going to be here. The mirror is going to kind of be here. Like I can have the window down and I can actually touch the mirror from my driving position just about. It's kind of just here. And then obviously you've got the, you can see the side of the headrest there, which is, almost a meter from my eye position, whereas in real life it would be here. And then, areas over here actually look pretty accurate. Now, when we kind of move around in the scene here, we move the camera around, basically anytime the camera is being held behind the position of my eyes, everything looks completely out of whack. So if Tom sort of walks around the back of the rig, you can see just how crazy and out of perspective everything looks. And you would have seen in some of the footage that we've shared on the channel before, where we've got a camera mounted behind showing the motion platform and whatnot, the car looks absolutely massive in comparison to the driving position. Now you might be wondering, how does this kind of work once we're up and running in the rig with the helmet cam on? The reason for that is essentially what we're creating with the helmet cam is almost like a two-dimensional view of a three-dimensional space. So as long as the field of view inside the sim, and as long as what you're displaying on the screens is set up correctly, once you put the helmet cam on, everything kind of just falls into place. But when you're actually sitting in the rig driving, it can work well with some cars, other cars it doesn't work as well. So this is an example of a car where it works okay. And you can see the door panels kind of going down the side there. Now, when I'm sitting here and I'm aiming on the road ahead of me, everything from sort of here outwards is pretty much in my peripheral vision anyway, so it looks pretty much as it would in the real world. But what you do need to be aware of is that when you're turning your head and you're actually looking at the sides here, the things that are appearing on the screens are physically further away from you than they would be in the real world. And because you're working with two-dimensional images on the screens that are basically just bending that two-dimensional image to account for the angles of the screens, then basically what's happening is anything that is further away from you than it would be in real life ends up being drawn a lot bigger than what it should be. And you can see, for example, here, the side of the door, because it's not as close physically as it should be, instead it just looks really big on the screen. So again, it doesn't really look problematic when you're using the helmet cam, when you're actually looking at the footage after it's been recorded, but actually sitting inside the car and looking around the space, it can look a little bit weird. And generally it's, again, things that are meant to be closer to you than they're able to be drawn on the screen. So that is the reason why you don't see a lot of, smaller open wheel content on the channel. Skip Barber I can actually get looking pretty good. F1 cars look pretty good on this as well, but anything smaller than that, anything like a Formula V, just starts to get a little bit crazy and a little bit unmanageable. And there's too many trade-offs in terms of what I have to do to make it look good on camera versus what's actually drivable in the real world. So again, large car syndrome hasn't turned out to be as big of an issue as I thought it would be. And I am in most cases able to find, I guess, a bit of a happy medium between what you guys are seeing on the camera and, the car actually being drivable for me sitting in the rig. But definitely an important consideration. So next consideration now, UI visibility. Now, some sims handle this better than others. Some allow you to move around UI elements to suit the space that you're working with a little bit better than others. iRacing in particular is particularly frustrating in this rig, simply because the replay controls UI elements all tend to fall down behind the steering wheel here where I can't see them. Now, obviously, one of the advantages of this rig is that we're able to have the steering wheel quite high, so you're able to actually see parts of the car down below the steering wheel. And that's one of the big differentiators between this rig and a lot of the other rigs that you would see on YouTube, where the screens kind of start about midway across the wheel or further higher again. So that does create trade-offs in terms of UI usability. You'll see in a lot of videos where I'm working with replays and stuff, I'm kind of leaning around, trying to see around things. And you know, while it does work in terms of, again, content creation, it can be quite frustrating for, you know, just trying to enjoy a game without even thinking about content creation, or even streaming. Things like that can be quite tricky as well. I often find that, you know, I'm trying to go into a replay, I'm trying to join a race, and I'm trying to move around and, you know, trying to see what's going on. It can just become very cumbersome and very tricky. So I'm hoping that in time, a lot of the sims will allow us a little bit more adaptability in the UI design, allow us to move elements around. I've been hassling iRacing to do that for a very long time now. But yeah, just another, I mean, it's going to be an issue with a lot of other sim rigs as well. It's not necessarily a big deal for a rig like this, but it's just another thing that I thought was worth mentioning, because it is something that does frustrate me quite regularly trying to drive this rig compared to my old rig with the smaller screens that were higher up. Now, another thing that you might have noticed on this rig is the bezel free kits that we're running there to obviously remove the bezels from the screens. Now, those are ASUS bezel free kits. Unfortunately, those kits have now been discontinued, so it is quite difficult to get your hands on these now. But these were designed originally for, I think, 27-inch screens or smaller. There are a couple of 3D printed kits to give you little extension bars and make them fit 32-inch screens. But essentially what we've done here, and we've done a couple of videos on this now, but I'll touch on it again quickly now for you guys, is take two kits and then invert the second panel and then have them kind of joined in the middle here. And there are a couple of trade-offs here as well. Let me just move this tripod out of the way. So if we come in a little bit closer, so what we've done here, and this is an idea that I stole from Karl Gosling, so I'll drop a link to his channel down in the description for you guys. What we have here is a little piece of plastic here, see-through plastic, which doesn't have any sort of lensing effect, so it doesn't distort the image. We've poked a little tiny hole in there, and then there's a little piece of string threaded through with a knot in it, so it kind of works like an anchor almost. And then that string is pulled through the bezel and then pulled in tight and taped on the back of the screen. And that basically allows us to pull those panels in and anchor them in place without having anything there that blocks the vision. But there is a little bit of distortion there. You can see about a 1 or 2 pixel line there where there's a bit of a gap between the panels, just where the string threads through. And obviously you do get those lines in. Now when you're actually sitting in the rig, it looks pretty darn good and just barely even noticeable on camera. But you know, obviously it is a consideration there as well. You are going to have to fidget around. It is quite difficult to get these mounted on your own. And we have had quite a few instances where, you know, the bottom things popped off the screen, fallen on the ground. And these things do scratch extremely easily. I've already been through a couple of kits where they've been damaged. And obviously, you know, it's pretty much impossible to replace them now. But even when you could replace them, they were extremely expensive. So just another consideration there. Now, when it comes to the bezels as well, another thing I should mention, just while we're talking about availability of bezel-free kits, one of the advantages of having large screens like this is that the bezels are actually a lot smaller in relation to the overall screen area. So what I found is that when I was driving without the bezel-free kits, it actually didn't bother me anywhere near as much having those bezels there as it does on smaller screens. You can imagine with smaller screens, so say 27-inch screens up close to you, a fair amount of what you're seeing there is actual bezel, whereas with these guys, because they're further away, the bezels are a lot thinner in relation to the overall screen space. So I would say if it wasn't for the content creation aspect, I probably wouldn't even bother with the bezel-free kits. They do create quite a bit of distortion there, but again, obviously because the screens are bigger, that area of distortion relative to the overall screen space is less, but again, important considerations. So next up is a topic which I didn't even consider when we were first building this setup. I thought about screen angles, I thought about floor space, I thought about how we were gonna actually get a camera to look like it was inside the cabin of the car. I thought about what I thought was everything, but the one thing that I didn't consider was vertical sweet spot. Now, what I mean by that, I'm gonna jump in the rig quickly now, and I'm gonna grab my helmet cam. Now, this is something that a few of you guys have actually noticed in some of the footage. So this is my helmet cam, and what I would normally do is, and it looks ridiculous, but it works, pop it on my head like so. And the aim here is to try and have the lens of the camera as close to my eye as I possibly can without blocking too much of my vision. Now, if I close my right eye and just look through my left eye, 50% of my vision is actually blocked by the camera, but I actually have an injury in my left eye, which means that my brain is primarily taking the image from my right eye anyway. So it actually doesn't impact my overall vision as much as you might think it would. And I'm able to drive pretty comfortably with it. I adjust it pretty quickly. But what we've needed to do is get the camera as close to my eye position as possible for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, obviously, you want to have the perspective on camera of the person actually driving the car. A lot of helmet cam footage that you see from sim rigs as well as real world kind of looks like the camera's up here and pointing down. So you're kind of looking at your feet, you're looking at the top of the wheel, and you're only sort of seeing a small amount of what's actually outside the car. Conversely, if you have the camera too low, so if you have it down at chin level, then what you're seeing is more steering wheel and it's kind of hard to see up over the dash and out of the car. So I wanted to try and make the footage look as authentic and, you know, as much like you guys are seeing what I'm seeing as was possible. And that was the best way that we were able to achieve that, through a massive amount of trial and error. But what I didn't consider when we were first putting the rig together is just how small the vertical sweet spot looks. Now, what I mean by that is if we quickly drive out here, so I'm just gonna get to a point where there's some nice sort of perpendicular barriers. So let's go into the middle of the circuit here. Okay, so this should work pretty well. So if you have a look at the barrier just there, you can see if I hold the camera at my eye level, that barrier looks like it's straight, in that you can see there's a nice continuous line. It doesn't look like it's buckling as we drive past it. Now, if right now I'm holding that camera at pretty much exactly my eye level. Now, if I raise the camera up, you can see the higher I go, that barrier looks like it's starting to bend towards me. So if I bring the camera back into my driving position, we'll move it across just a little bit so you can see there, and then lift the camera up, all of a sudden everything looks way out of whack and bent. And you can see the dash there looks all out of whack. Everything just looks completely distorted. Now I bring it back down to my eye level and you can see it comes good again. Then if I start to go down, you can see it buckles the other way. So now it's bending upwards. Now, a few people have commented on some of our videos before we got this right that, you know, it looks like our angle adjustments are out. This isn't a function of the actual angle of the screen. It's purely just a function of your eye position or camera position relative to the screen. So there's no sort of compensation that you can make for that in calculations in terms of, you know, how you set up the screens in the software. It's purely just based on the height of the camera relative to the screen position. So what we've had to do is we've had to actually fine tune the height of our screens just so that we can get that looking right. But when I say sweet spot, what I mean by that is even the tiniest little bit out and it does start to look distorted. And you'll notice a lot of my videos actually have a habit of starting the video off sitting quite high inside the rig, and then as I'm driving, I'm sinking down, then I might brake and go forward like that. And all of those things are moving around that camera position relative to the vertical position of the screens. And you will notice in a lot of the videos that those side barriers tend to move up and down, or the dash starts to distort a little bit as well. Now, another consideration there as well is you need to kind of choose where you want that sweet spot to lie, because you can imagine here at the moment we've got a barrier which is sitting here and that looks nice and straight. But if we compare that to a straight line lower down on the screen, then that actually looks distorted. And if I grab the camera again quickly, have a look at that barrier, you can see that looks pretty straight. So got a nice clean straight line across there, but you can actually see the dash looks a little bit distorted. Now, if I move the camera down, you can see now the dash looks correct. So we've got a nice straight line across the dash, but now the barrier looks out of whack. So the sweet spot on the screen relative to what you guys are seeing there is probably only about that big, meaning that if I move the camera up even just that tiny amount, it will create distortion. So that is that's probably the biggest limitation that we have with this system, is just how tight that sweet spot is. And it's something that I hadn't even thought about or considered when we were building the system. And it did take us quite a bit of time just to get things looking as best they could possibly be within those limitations. And even for me right now, from my seating position and my eye position, the side screens do look ever so slightly buckled downwards, but from where the camera is, again, talking about having content creation being the priority here rather than what I'm actually seeing, it does look right for the camera for most instances, for the things that you're going to be looking at the most. But if you do look around and start looking at the other straight lines inside the cabin, it does start to distort a little bit. Now, we touched on reflections and ambient lighting in relation to the ambient lighting system that we have in the rig just a moment ago, but another really important consideration is natural light and how that will impact your experience as well. Now, what I mean by that is if you have sunlight coming through or you have other lights inside the room which you can't switch off for whatever reason, then that is obviously going to impact your experience as well. And you can actually see on the camera right now, just above my head there, you can see a reflection of the ambient light which is sitting behind all the room light, just so we've got enough light on my face to record the video comfortably. So As I said before, both studios that we've had now, we've had complete control of the lighting. We've been able to block out all of the external lighting, so there's no sunlight or anything like that coming in. Basically what it boils down to here is the bigger the screens, the more opportunity you're gonna have for distracting reflections to show up and take away from the immersion of driving in the rig. So we've made it to the last item on the list now. This is gonna be relevant for people that are wanting to run motion systems with their rigs. Now you may have already noticed here that we're running a D-box system, which is responsible for moving the pedals, the seat, the wheel, pretty much everything that is, well, everything that's connected to the sim rig itself. And the screens aren't mounted to this. So the screens are static, they stay there and the rest of the rig moves by itself. Now that creates a couple of issues. Obviously you can imagine if you're trying to record a video and you're trying to make the dash and the steering wheel and the pedals and everything else move in unison together. If you have motion in the rig but not on the screens, then you're gonna have a disconnect. Things are gonna be moving in relation to each other. Now, some of you who've been watching the channel for a while might have seen a video that we did where we actually used a Track IR5 as a sort of, I guess, makeshift motion compensation system. And we had some pretty good results with that, even with a traction loss system, which involved a lot more movement overall in the rig than what we have now with just the D-box system. So with about a day and a half's work of fine tuning, we were able to get that to work pretty well, but it wasn't perfect, and it would have always been better to have the screens moving in unison with the rig. Now, while the weight itself may not be an issue depending on the motion system that you're running, the issue that you more than likely will run into is just rigidity on the outer extremities of the screen. So you can imagine if you're using a conventional sort of mounting system that mounts the screens onto the back of the rig, then that's not going to be strong enough to support the weight of 40 kilograms per screen with all that weight sitting on the outside if it's all fixed in the middle here. So you're going to need some sort of armature on the back of the rig to connect those screens back in, and it's just going to become a real cumbersome mess overall. So what you'll more than likely find is that those screens will move around and kind of flex and either crack the screens themselves or just come loose and move around, or at the very least the bezel free kits are going to pop off just from that movement. So we found for us the best solution was to just have the screens static on the ground and then have the motion rig running independently. Now that did of course come with a couple of compromises. We did have to turn the motion down overall on the D-box system. Now that is something that I will definitely explore and elaborate on more when we get around to our full review of a couple of different motion systems that we got coming up soon. I prefer to actually have the movement dialed back a little bit and rely mostly on just the kind of haptic vibration and that kind of feedback. I find that's where most of the value comes from these motion systems. But for those of you who are wanting to be really thrown around inside the rig, it's definitely going to be an issue for you. And again, it will pull away from the immersion if the screens aren't moving in unison with the rig. So ideally you want to stick to a screen size which is going to allow you to have everything connected together and everything moving in unison. So there you have it, guys. That is my list of, I guess, things that I've learned and things that I've had to consider as we've gone down this rabbit hole. And some of these things I thought of before we started putting the system together, and I kind of figured it out in my mind how it was going to go together while we were building it, made sure I had the right components and everything to make it work. But there were a few things there that I didn't really even think about until I was in the situation. I kind of thought, oh, how are we going to make this work? And for the most part, we've been able to work around things, but there are definitely some things in there that you need to consider. And I think the most important message here is that even though this does look awesome on camera and it is an absolutely amazing experience, again, this rig has been built primarily with content creation in mind. And if I were building a rig just for personal enjoyment, for just racing and not worrying about content creation at all, there are plenty of things that I would have done differently. So we might do another video where we explore my ultimate sim racing rig for just a racing scenario without the content creation side of things. Maybe sort of see how that might come together. But yeah, let us know if that's something that you'd be interested in down in the comments below, and we might be able to make that happen. There's a couple of other things that we can elaborate on there too. And if you do have any specific questions about this setup or anything that you feel like we haven't covered or would like to see covered in more detail, let us know in the comments, and we're happy to answer those or put together some more videos covering some of these topics. So thank you very much for watching, guys. I know that a sim rig like this is not something that a lot of people are looking at building, but if it is something that you've been dreaming about doing maybe one day, then hopefully this has cleared up a couple of the misconceptions and given you a better understanding of why we've done things the way we've done them and what we would recommend you might do differently depending on what you're trying to achieve with your thing. And as I said at the start of the video, the awesome thing about all of this stuff is that everybody's take on it is a little bit different. The way one person does things is going to be different depending on what they're trying to get out of the sim racing experience. And that's, I think, one of the things that makes sim racing so awesome. So thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, and we will see you in the next one. Bye.